All right, welcome to an April wrap-up. We're going to talk about the 9 things I read and 2 things I DNF'd. I have brought back categories, which if you're old here, you know I used to do wrap-ups where I grouped things into categories. It was like a mini recommendation video. You could hop around. And then I just haven't been reading enough or having enough strong opinions or having the spoons to do that, so I've been just doing things in like order, either of order I've read it or rating, but we're bringing categories back. I've got 4 categories, and the 5th if you include DNFs as a category. So we shall be getting into this. Starting with the DNFs, we'll just get the negatives out of the way. I did a Nebula project earlier this month. My first Friday reads of the month is where I read all of the Nebula novels, or at least attempted them. And there's only one of those that I paused, so I'm not going to talk about it in the DNFs part of this video, but 2 of them, I gave them a really good shot, and they are DNF'd, and I'm not going back. It's just not happening. The first one we'll talk about is The Terraformers. I read 50% of this book. I gave it a good shot. I gave it a good shake. It was not bad. I just didn't care. And I do think that's something I've been trying to get better at noticing is when I don't care. And, when do you push through that because there might be a reason to care by the end of it, or it's worth it to gain a new perspective or a new experience. In this case, I had read other science fiction that had worked for me better, that thematically touched similar ground, and this just wasn't doing much new for me. It was covering a lot of classic science fiction themes. What does it mean to be a human or conscious life? We're looking at corporate entities funding huge scientific endeavors and what corruption comes with that. We were looking at starting a new world and what are the political and social, there's a lot of politics of starting a new world and making new constitutions and things like that. All of that is in the Terraformers, and it does generational jumping with, I believe, some overlap of characters in each part. I only made it to part 2. And I just didn't have emotional buy-in, and I could tell the book wanted me to. And I got to a point where it's I guess I could technically finish this in 3 hours, or I could play a video game, or I could watch a movie, and so I put it down. So it just didn't land for me emotionally. And thematically, like I said, I have been in that sort of thematic pool for a while, and it wasn't doing anything new enough to make me ignore the fact that I wasn't connecting to characters. So, similar kind of issues, but completely different genre. We have the Water Outlaws. So this is a gender-flipped style of a Chinese story. I think it's called Wuxian. I could be pronouncing that wrong. But it has this character who is basically in the military hierarchy, even though she's a woman, and that's not very common, and she kind of keeps her head low. She doesn't want to mess with the status quo. She's worked really hard to get here, worked really well to be a single mom and have her kids be mildly successful in good situations. But then one day, no fault of her own, she gets put in a situation in which she is labeled a traitor, whether that's true or not, and then she gets to join these group of bandits because she has to be either in exile or in prison or dead. Those are her options. And my issues with this one is just more, again, character connection. I made it about 130 pages into it, so that's about 30-ish% of the book, I believe, maybe 25% of the book. And I could tell there were going to be conflicts within the bandit camp, interpersonal drama that I really wasn't going to enjoy watching. I really didn't hate any of our point of views. We had 3 or 4 point of view characters, but they were archetypes I have seen before, and so none of them were bringing anything new to the table or had me emotionally invested in their stories or arcs. At first I was reading it, it's this feels cozy and comfortable and tropes I've read before, but there wasn't enough there to make me care. There was even that classic trope of there's this power in the north coming to get us, we must prepare for it. It had a lot of things that I read a lot in fantasy, and not in ways that made me want to keep going. So I put it down. And I haven't picked it up again. The writing was fine though. I had no issues with anything in particular other than I wasn't vibing. So those are my DNFs. So now we are going to get into my 4 categories. And I've read a lot of science fiction this month, guys. I believe if I look at this list, 4 of the books, science fiction. Pretty exciting. One of them's horror. And then the rest, 2 are horror. And then the rest are fantasy. So not bad, not bad. Let's start with grief. I have 3 works that really centered around grief and loss and recovery from loss and trauma. And we'll start with Linghan. This is a novella that was nominated for the Nebulas. And actually, I didn't know this when I got it, but when you get the ebook or the audiobook, which I kind of recommend the audiobook. I think the audiobook's very atmospheric. Even though the audio narrator herself is kind of dry, but there's sound effects, and I think it works really well. We'll get into that in a second. But in that, you actually have more than just the novella. There are also other short stories by the author, which I wasn't aware of. So it ended way sooner than I anticipated because I thought I had just gotten this one novella, not like a bind-up sort of collection situation. But I just read the novella. That's all I read. And so, like I said, the audiobook kind of increases the tension because this is a horror story. It is unsettling. And so the audiobook with its little sound effects, and almost even kind of because of the dry narrator, especially with the themes, just really makes it unsettling. And I really enjoyed how that was brought to be. So the conceit of this book is that there are these haunted houses in this town called home. And people really want to live here because if you live in these houses, you can potentially get to meet one of the lost loved ones in your life, and they will be with you in the house. It is so sought after that there are these people who camp out in the yards of those who live in the houses. They're called lingerers. And there's this huge bidding process for when houses go on the market. And we're following this from the perspective of 3 individuals. A young girl whose parents can't let go of the loss of her, I guess it was older brother, but now like she's older than what he is in terms of his coming back to life because he was lost as a kid. We have this young boy whose parents are lingerers, so he's doesn't really care about getting a house, but they really want a house. And then we have this woman who lives across the street, and she's the one person in home whose house isn't haunted. And it's just a really interesting story. And like it's just such a blatant metaphor or allegory of like which people can let go of and move on from grief and which people get stuck into certain ruts because of it. And it has this like just unsettling quality to it. Like it's not a ghost story. And it's not even like a haunted house story. But it does feel like kind of, it's a dark night. You sit down, you listen to this book, and it has that dread, unsettling feeling that I think can be really attractive in the horror genre. So I really enjoyed that one. Another one is Mammoths at the Gate. This is the 4th Singing Hill Cycle novella. I'm just continuing to read these, even though for some reason I do not love these as much as everyone else, and it gives me massive FOMO that they just do not land for me like they do for everyone else. This is a story when she, the cleric who's been collecting all the stories in the novella series, goes back home. And they find out when they get home that one of the clerics they grew up with has passed away. And this is what causes this whole string of events of tension in this novella, where we have these 2 children who are the grandchildren of this cleric who passed away. And they're the grandchildren of the cleric before the cleric joined the priesthood. When you join the priesthood, you lose your identity. It's separate from you. That person is essentially legally dead. But they claim that they want to have this body to bury with their grandmother, and they have these huge mammoths, so it creates this tension. And on the flip side, the clerics want to respect this past cleric's wish. This was, their new name, their new identity. They don't want to lose the burial rights. So it creates this tension. I didn't like that part. The part's not my favorite. The part I do like is when we learn about stories about this cleric and how we use stories to process grief. I like that. I like that a lot. The ending's a little weird. So I know a lot of people love this story. And what I can assume is because it just has such strong themes of grief, but also coming home and finding home changed, and what does that mean when you have the nostalgia for what a place was versus what it actually is. I could see those themes resonating super well with people. For some reason, those themes were not like striking the right chord with me and who I am and how I interpret them, which, just is what it is. I tried physically reading it and I did audio. Like I tried all the ways to see if like I was like cheating myself out of the experience. Because so many people in my comments were like, listen, I know I didn't like books 2 and 3 as much as 1 either, but this is as good as the first book. And the first book's still my favorite. And I think part of it is the first book is puzzly. The first book, you're getting like piecemeal, like little crumbs of world building as you learn about this empress. And I really liked that execution. I think it was just like perfect for me. And I just don't think any of the other ones, they've all just been so straightforward, linear up to this point for me. Like even if they have flashbacks or something like that, they just don't have that same magic as the first one did. It's still good though. All right, and then the last one is The Angel of Indian Lake, which I'm still processing. It's a slasher in a horror trilogy. And this town has already gone through 2 slashers in the first 2 books in the trilogy. So the town, it has some trauma, and our main characters have some trauma. So I think it fits very well in this category. And like I said in my Friday reads, I think this sticks the landing. And it's only grown on me as I've gotten further away from it, as I think of that last chapter and like, oh, that last chapter is so good. And I was actually watching Kayla Books and Lala. She just wrapped up Angel of Lindian Lake in one of her wrap-ups. And she's kind of right, and I never thought of it this way. Stephen Graham Jones really does not hold your hand in certain aspects. Like in some ways, these are slasher stories. They're not that deep. There's not like a whole bunch to keep track of. People are dying, things are stressful. And like, yes, if you don't know slasher movies, maybe you'll miss references here or there. I don't know all the slasher movies, and I was fine. Like, I only know the classics, like Scream, Halloween, Psycho. That's about all I know. You know, like, I'm not like a connoisseur. And I was fine there. But something I have told people, and why I'm glad that I only spent like 6 months reading the whole trilogy, and I'll get into this in a should you read when I film that for like next week or the following week, is there are a lot of names, and there are a lot of people, and there are connections in this city. He doesn't remind you of these connections. So you might like see a name and be like, I cannot remember. Who are you and why do you matter for this story? And how does that fit into the plot? And I think those are the things he does not spoon feed you and like kind of like lets you sink or swim on your own. So even though I don't think you really need to remember plot points per se of previous books, you, in terms of remembering characters in the community and why they might be doing what they're doing and how they fit into the previous stories, that's a little bit harder to get on your toes. But I still think it's fantastic. And if you were worried because the second book wasn't as much in Jade's perspective, this book's entirely Jade's perspective. And it was lovely and sad. And yeah, it was great. It was great. Not my favorite in the trilogy, but like I am a sucker for a book that sticks the landing. Like I do love a good ending. I'm an endings girl, as we have discussed. Okay. All right, the next category, because I'll keep my sci-fi categories for the end, are books about gods. We got some fantasy books about gods. I read 2 of them. First one I read was for the Nebula Project. This is the Shiggity and the Mask of Ubalafon, I think so. This is about Shiggity and Noma, who are kind of these freelancing gods. They basically don't work for any corporation. And normally gods work for corporations because people don't believe in gods as much anymore, so they kind of have to spread the prayers and the spirits. And it's just a commentary on capitalism. And that it's just like a fun satire part of this book. But Noma and Shiggity are freelancers. Shiggity is a freelancer because of Noma. Noma's a freelancer because of her backstory that you slowly learn about throughout the book. And it's about their relationship and how, you know, Shiggity is in one place and Noma is in another. And Shiggity wants to just know where they stand. Like, he has a preference for where he would like their relationship to be. But in general, he would just like to know, do you love me? Do you not love me? And Noma won't even give him like that straight of an answer. And part of that is because of her baggage, her grief, her loss that you learn about through the story. And the plot of this all is they have to do a task for one of these bigger gods to get out of debt from them. And it's a heist. And it's one of those stories where you start at the end and you work your way back up to it. There's a lot of flashbacks for both characters, and then you catch back up in the timeline. And there's kind of a multiverse element because you have the gods plane and the human plane. It was fun. I think I don't always like contemporary god stories, but this one was a good time. I really liked the audiobook. I couldn't immersion read it because the audiobook was different from my version of the physical book, at least different enough in terms of like syntax arrangement and things like that, but I really liked the narrator. So I would highly recommend it. Like, I liked it enough that I just didn't ever physically read it. I just listened to it. So it was a good time. Something that I have been saying for people if they might not know, Noma is like a very lust-driven goddess. Like, that's a kind of sort of one of her things that she like uses for power. So if you do not like lusty, maybe slightly erotic scenes, beware of this. Like, it's definitely not the focus of it, but there's definitely more than one scene that could make you feel uncomfortable for sure. And then the other one was a reread, and this is Kingdom of Gods by N.K. Jemisin, the 3rd book in the Inheritance trilogy, and this is the biggest glow up of the trilogy reread for me. My first read of it, I think I gave 4 stars because it wasn't, like, it was a little long. Like, it's a 600-page book. Like, it's a little long. And I didn't really know where it was going, and, like, Sia's a great character, but maybe not my favorite character. But now, like, knowing the point of it, and knowing the point of the whole trilogy, which is, like, so hard to talk about and appreciate without spoiling things because it's just it's so good. But also, if I tell you what the trilogy's like purpose is, it spoils plot points. And it's like, yeah. Anyways, so following Sia, something happens to him and we don't know why. And also, just like every book, there's also like a plot B where murder is happening and we have to figure out who's doing the murder, or else the end of the world is nigh, which is like kind of a theme for the first 3 books as well. And so that's happening in this book, and I was just enthralled the entire time. I loved the narrator for this entire trilogy, and it's not even Robin Miles, which, you know, that's just shocking within itself. I love the commentary on forgiveness, friendship, family, love, growing up, change, and how do we accept change. It's great. It's great. I love it. I love it so much. I buddy read it with Laura, and then once again, I harp on this all the time, and I don't think it matters to anyone but me, but if you've read The Broken Kingdoms, and that's the second book in the trilogy, and if you at all ever felt like the ending of The Broken Kingdoms was cruel to you, and if you've read it, you understand, you need to read the short story called Not the End, that is in only the single printed editions of Kingdom of Gods, not the bind up. It's in the extras, the Orbit extras at the end that are always like the darker coloring. I believe it's also in the UK edition. I guess I could check because I own that somewhere, because there was a time where they were changing the covers, because like I love these covers. I love them. But I guess publishing didn't. And even Jemison likes the newer covers. But I don't think Jemison and I have the same taste in what I think her covers should be. And it's okay. She can be wrong sometimes. So Kingdom of Gods, lovely. Well, I think, honestly, the Inheritance trilogy is like my favorite version of gods and human existing together, and how messy that can be, especially when people have different interpretations of time. Because a lot of what something is worth has to do with time. And if you value time more, say if you're mortal, it's just going to be really different. And I think that comes across really well, especially also the idea that mortals almost have more freedom than gods, because we are not tied as much to a quote unquote nature, whereas gods have natures, and that can really shape what they can and can't do, even though they're more powerful. I really love it. And that's probably why, although I like Shiggity, I don't like it as much as the Kingdom of Gods or the Broken Kingdoms, because it's just like, those are just like top tier thought processes. And then also really like bringing in themes of different politics of these worlds, and corruption and slavery and capital. Like everything's woven in so well. Like, and it's like the backstory. It's not even the B plot. Like those things are like the C, but like they're there enough to make the world feel fleshed out. And I was nervous about reading these again, because I had seen some people reading them who had like loved the first book, but then it fell off for them. And like, I liked all 3 about equally. And I was right. They're all so good. So once I read the novella and short stories, I'll do a should you read again for that, because the first should you read is from like 2020, and that was back when I didn't even have a ring light. I used a lamp and my web camera, so probably worth an update there. So those are my gods books, and now we'll get into sci-fi adventure stories. Starting with Where Peace is Lost. And on my list, I just put Peace, which is not particularly helpful for this type of thing. But Where Peace is Lost is a Valerie Valdez. It is a standalone. Alas, anyone who would like another book, she has come out and said is a standalone. She's not publishing more. It is written in a way where you could see more stories coming from it, but it is like a standalone adventure sort of story. And it definitely pulls from video games. So if you like video games like Horizon Zero Dawn, aesthetically speaking, that is here. We got mechs, which is like a big part of Horizon. And the land itself is really interesting. They really try to coexist with the land. And that's like a big part of the story is there's this mech that's been turned on, and they don't want it to destroy people or the land. And so that's where our main character and her friend join these other 2 strange foreign individuals to go turn off this mech. And that's the conceit of the whole story. And there are mysteries for a lot of people that we slowly learn about, especially our main character, who's definitely like a Geralt, Aloy sort of mix. And it's just fun. I think it's just a really strong version of comfortable tropes for this type of story. I don't think it's mind-blowing, but in terms of like, you want to have a reluctant hero, you want to have mysterious backstories, you want like an adult slow burn-ish romance. Slow burn-ish. I say ish, okay? If you want like a precocious, like almost naive, but not quite naive adult character who's just really sweet, like that bubbly personality like in Firefly, that mechanic. It's all here. It's like all very comfortable character types. It's a fun setting. It's a normal, familiar story. It's actually one of the few travel stories I like. This is a travel story. We're traveling across the continent to get to the place to do the thing. Does not always work for me. This one did. It's not even the first one this year that's worked for me, so maybe I need to reassess if that's a negative trope for me. Who knows? And then the other sci-fi adventure is Ethan of Athos, Bejeweled. So good. This is one of my favorites. I said this on Friday Reads. It snuck up on me. I think I like it more than any of the Miles stories, and I really like the Miles stories. This is about Ethan. He's from a place called Athos. Everyone there is chromosomally XY. You are not allowed to be XX and live in Athos. It's a big thing. But he has to leave Athos to go find more ovarian cultures because theirs are dying. And in so doing, gets wrapped up in all of this political stuff that he did not sign up for. And it's fascinating. We're on like a space station for the first time, which is really cool. Like, this is, again, kind of like with the Inheritance trilogy, really solid world building that's really subtle. Like, there's a scene, this isn't like a big spoiler, like I said, he gets caught up in stuff really quickly. We have to get rid of a body without getting caught. How do you do that on a space station? And we think about it, and the way that they solve that problem was just so fun. I really enjoyed that. You do meet a character from Warrior's Apprentice, but she wasn't a main character in that book or anything, but it was just kind of fun seeing that connection. And then there are some fascinating decisions characters make by the end of the book where you're just like, is that actually morally the right decision for my main character to make? I do not know. And you're just left with that. You have nothing else to think, but just like, we actually are going to do that. Okay. And it actually uses one of my least favorite science fiction tropes to great effect. I'll be vague about it because I don't want to spoil anything. But there's one of I have a science fiction trope that I do not like. And this actually pulls it off pretty well. And then my last two that we will talk about are political science fictions. I'm basing it off this because it feels like political situations, societies, and their norms are like a big part of it. Genre-wise, you could probably call them a lot of different things. But we'll start with the biggest surprise of the month. Translation State by Ann Leckie. This is a book in the Rocked Empire, and this is a standalone. I think it takes place after the events of the main trilogy, may or may not have a character from the main trilogy. I could read it without knowing what happened in the main trilogy, but if you didn't want to be spoiled for global events of the main trilogy, maybe, read it in chronological order. That said, I didn't love the main trilogy. Like, I read the first book, gave it 3 stars, was really disappointed, never continued on. I picked this up because it was a Nebula novella, and I'm like, okay, let's just try it. And I loved it. Like, it made me want to read. We have 3 perspectives. I was invested in all of their arcs and trials and how they intersected. And it was just a really nice, small story in a really cool world. Again, I love worlds. That's why I read science fiction and fantasy. I know everyone does things for different reasons. I really like exploring places that are really cool. And the Rocked Empire, even though I didn't love the first book, is a very cool galaxy. It is fascinating. Representations of gender, different species, and all of that's here. And there is like this political tension because there's this treaty that needs to be signed again. And that is like at the center of this story. But it doesn't feel like it's at the center because the center of our story is like we have a bunch of characters trying to like find themselves. Some are legitimately coming of age. Some are learning things about themselves they have to reconcile. Some of them are just trying to forge a new path in the world. And that's where I feel the focus. And I love it. I love it so much. And I get to do that while exploring a really cool place. So I think that's why that one really landed for me. And the last one is Those Beyond the Wall, which is a companion novel for The Space Between Worlds. It does have characters from The Space Between Worlds. It will reference plot events in The Space Between Worlds. So if you do not want to be spoiled, you should read them in world chronological order. That said, our main character, Mr. Scales, is not in the first book. At least, not in a way that I remembered. That said, I did not reread The Space Between Worlds before reading this. I do know people who did, who love The Space Between Worlds, who do not like this book. But I, just reading it this year, loved it. Made me want to read, loved the audiobook. Like, I purposefully waited for the audiobook because I listened to a sample and I was like, yes, I'm going to like that. I just really like it. So the politics here is that this world, its whole conceit is we always have ash, and then we have those in the wall. And those in the wall have a nice atmosphere, and so they have a better quality of life. It's just very much like an active, aggressive metaphor for how we live, especially in the United States. But I think globally speaking, you literally have haves and have-nots all the time in terms of access to medicine and tech and infrastructure. Here, we're just really blatantly showing it as people who live in like the desertified area with like the really bright sun that can cause a lot of like blood toxicity and cancer, etc. And then those who get to live behind the walls. And those who live behind the walls, you have to work really hard to be able to immigrate there and be able to have access to a better quality of living. And then insult to injury, those who live in the walls, they came to this place and basically made it worse for those who live in Ash. They basically, colonized the area. So again, a lot of this, relates to our real world. It's very on the nose in that way, but to me it was cathartic. A lot of the theming is so aggressively shouted. I cannot express that enough. If you are at all in the know about any of these issues, you're just going to nod your head and go like, yeah. And that's either going to work for you and be cathartic, or it's just going to be like, oh my God, I get it. I already got it. This is doing nothing for me. I can't imagine it going any other way. Especially because this book was made from a place of anger by the author. Now, that's it. I felt it more cathartically. I didn't feel the anger, but you read the author's note, you kind of know what you're getting into. And I really love that we follow this complex story through the eyes of Mr. Scales, who is a fascinating character. She is so flawed. She is a really flawed individual. She's a great way of learning about the Ash dynamics in terms of like how that community works, because that community is also really interesting because they're not perfect and they're actually perceived to be as really violent. Part of that violence is to maintain control, but also they're not actually as violent as people think. But also sometimes they are, but a lot of what they do is rehabilitation. And Mr. Scales is an example of that rehabilitation instead of incarceration. And that's always a really fascinating world-building theme to look at, because it's really hard, I feel, for people to imagine a world where we don't just throw people into prison-type systems when they do atrocious acts. And in this case, Mr. Scales has done an atrocious act. It's not like, oh, they stole something once, No, this is a lot of times people be like, no, I believe we should have the death penalty for X, and Mr. Scales might meet your definition of that. And they're also just kind of a self-centered individual, and I think that's really fascinating. There's a lot of these big things going on, and a lot of times they make selfish decisions, and you just want to be like, no, stop thinking about this character. They are not good for you, and they are just dumb. So I think it can evoke a lot of emotions, this read. And some of them might not be emotions you want to experience, and it might not make it a good reading experience. I do think I also saw a lot of reviews where people were like, Kara's not acting like herself in this book. Kara's not a central focus for me in this story, so I wasn't really hyper analyzing it because you're not in her head. And I think that's also the difference. Here you're in Mr. Scales' head. They're telling the story. It is an unreliable narrator just from the get-go. They're telling you a story and you have to take it from face value. And I think the space between worlds, if I'm remembering right, is primarily Kara telling the story as well. And so, when you're not in someone's head, it's interesting how they can come across when someone else is interpreting their actions or reading what they're putting out in the world. I really like the ending. Again, I think the ending is really interesting. I just find it interesting when authors ask a question, and I like to see if they ever take the easy way out or if they try something and see if it works. And yeah, I thought it was interesting seeing the thought experiment play itself out to its natural conclusions, because I just didn't know where else it was going to go. So that's why I think of it as a very political science fiction, even though there is still that multiverse aspect that exists in the space between worlds. So yeah. And it has a thriller mystery element that I completely forgot about till right now, because that was not why I was reading the story. But there is a thriller mystery element of people are dying. Why? And it is there's plot reasons for it, and it's important for the plot, but obviously based off my review, was I here for the plot? No. I was here for just watching it and the characters and their fascinating relationships and this society and what it represents and how it relates to our world. That's what I was taking from it. And I'm just going to read anything Micaiah Johnson writes. Truly. It was just really good. I'm glad I bought it, even if the cover is probably not as pretty as the first one. I just don't care. I'm glad I have both. So that's what I read. Let me know what you read this month, what you would recommend to me that you read this month. What's your most recommended read of the month, and what's your least recommended read of the month? I guess for me, my most recommended read of the month. That's hard. I feel like a lot of these are very niche. I still think... Okay. Where Peace is Lost is probably the one that will land with the most people. That's the safest pick. You recommend the most is the safe pick. It doesn't mean I think it'll give the most 5-star experiences, but I think most people would have a good time with it. And then my least recommended pick would probably be Those Beyond the Wall, because I do think that's going to be a polarizing experience, because it's a very, I think, emotional experience one way or the other. It's either going to be incredibly frustrating or incredibly cathartic. Things are happening and there's no way to not emotionally respond to them in some way, in my opinion, at least. All right, if you just want to leave an emoji, though, to let me know you're here. I don't know. There's so many. There's so many books that I just have around me. Oh, let's leave a angel type emoji. That works for like kind of 2-ish books, but for sure for the Angel of Indian Lake, which is just like, what an end of an era. That was such a good trilogy. It just like makes me happy. Anyways, like if you liked it, subscribe if you want to, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.